Mark's Gospel records a strange vignette about the events on the night when Jesus was arrested. It's in chapter 14, verses 50 to 51. A certain young man was following, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. This naked young man has always intrigued me. Who was he? Why was he wandering around only wearing a thin shift? Did he have a secret assignation? Did Mark know him personally? So I wrote this story entitled The Naked Young Man as a possible way to answer these questions. I was there the night they arrested the Galilean, though I did not know at the time who it was. Passover moon was full, bright in the desert night sky. I did not see him at first, as he was by himself, praying, I was told later. When a band of people arrived, they were carrying swords and clubs. I found out later that they were henchmen of the chief priest. One man seemed to know exactly where to find the Galilean. He embraced the Galilean in greeting, then other members of the party seized him and bound him with ropes. Galilean asked why they'd come to arrest him under cover of darkness, since they'd known where his whereabouts all along. Then there was some kind of melee, during which one of the Galilean supporters struck off the ear of a member of the arresting party with his sword. Galilean was dragged off while his supporters hurried away on the opposite path. I realized that I shouldn't have got so close, but I was curious as to what was happening. Suddenly, one of the arresting party caught sight of me, the bright moon making such a contrast between light and shadow. He grabbed hold of the thin linen shift that I was wearing. Luckily, I wrenched my shoulder away from his grasp, left him just holding my garment. I ran away as fast as I could, fearing to be questioned about why I was there. But also to cover my nudity, for I was left naked as the moment I was born. Fortunately, I outran my assailant and gained the cover of darkness in a stand of olive trees. I could not have told my story at the time. However, now that I'm approaching the end of my days, I feel the obligation to confess to the other events of that tragic evening. You see, I was and am an accursed soul who prefers to lie with a man rather than a woman. I'm only too aware that this is an abomination in the eyes of God, according to the book of Leviticus. My sin and shame is doubly that of an ordinary man, for I am descended from the priestly tribe of Levi, and moreover I was a student of the priestly code. However, no matter my perverse and perverted ways, I followed the precepts of Leviticus concerning ritual cleanliness. Thus I always refrained from touching any person or thing after sexual activity the rest of the day, in order not to spread my defilement. I was scrupulous in washing both my body and my clothing to remove the contagion. Although the book of Leviticus does not explain whether the rituals on restoring purity apply to unnatural acts of sexual activity. However, these considerations explain why I was in the garden of the olive press that night, dressed only in a linen shift. It was Passover and I was 17 years old at the time. My family was fastidious about the prescribed rituals connected with the Passover meal. Early in the morning, my father had purchased a lamb for our festive meal at the temple market. At sundown was the 14th day of the month, and Nisan turned into the 15th. We reclined on our couches to begin the Passover celebration. Lamb had been slaughtered and roasted, its fragrance wafted through the house. My religiously observant father had smeared a portion of its blood upon the lintel of our door, in memory of God's commandment on the first Passover. Candles were lighted from a single candle held high by my mother. Then began the retelling of the story of our liberation. However, an impatience was growing and gnawing inside of me. For that night I had arranged to meet a new partner in the garden of the olive press. This lay immediately adjacent to our home, very convenient for my partakers of sinful pleasures. It was to be a new experience for me, my first liaison with a Gentile. In a world where Gentile and Judean were sharply segregated, this occurred ironically because of my father's position as a member of the temple's priestly staff. An unspoken détente existed between the temple priesthood and the Roman garrison. The Romans agreed to leave the ritual aspects of the Judeo-religious life unmolested, provided that the temple authorities only ensured only minimal overt hostility towards them. Inevitably, this led to interactions between the temple and the governor's palace. Since I was being groomed for a minor position in the temple, I spent time there each day studying the Holy Scriptures. And that was how I came to meet a minor official on the governor's staff. His name was Antonio. He came from time to time to deliver documents to the temple. He was permitted only to enter the outer court of the Gentiles. I was frequently deputed to be the one to receive the documents and to deliver them to the chief priest's office. Unlike me, Antonio had a fair complexion with blue eyes and golden hair. I was smitten with his beauty at first sight. Something unspoken passed between us from our first meeting. We realized that we were both members of the same tribe, not the tribes of Judah and Rome, but that secret tribe whose members transcend the bounds of ethnicity or creed. It was Antonio that I had arranged to meet that night among the olive trees. As the festive meal progressed, I squirmed on my silk-covered couch, my thoughts not of the miraculous escape of my ancestors from Egypt, but of Antonio, my curiosity as to what it would be like to be intimate with a Gentile. As the meal ended, I made my excuse to meet a friend. My heart beat so furiously that within my breast, I felt certain it would be heard and remarked upon. I left our living quarters and made my way through the gateway into the garden of the olive press. I made the bird call that was the agreed signal between myself and Antonio, and was thrilled to hear the answering response. Let me say that my anticipation was not misplaced. My Passover celebration was as consummate as I had imagined. Our voyage of mutual discovery taking place not 100 cubits from where the Galilean knelt at prayer. Afterwards, Antonio left to return to the garrison barracks. I was contemplating my return to the family compound when the noise of the arrest jolted me back into this world. I wanted to see what was going on, and as I hurried away from the clutches of the member of the temple guard who had seized my shift, I almost laughed at the thought that touching it had made him as ritually as unclean as I was myself. Fortunately, I was able to re-enter my home without being seen, since I was entirely naked, which would most certainly have provoked inquiry. After washing my private parts to remove their defilement, I lay on my bed and contemplated with some satisfaction the night's events. Alas, very few weeks later, the secret of my sexual proclivity became public knowledge. I was on my way to my place of work at the temple when I espied ahead of me Antonio's golden hair. I hurried forward to meet him in the hope of exchanging a few whispered endearments on our way to the temple. But I was horrified to see a member of the Sicarii approach Antonio in the crowd and plunge his dagger into Antonio's chest. I rushed up and caught my beloved as he fell, blood pouring from his wound. Tears streamed from my eyes and my sobs were audible to all. Antonio died in my arms. I kissed his cheek with futile admonitions. He'd not die. It was impossible for passers-by not to realize what was going on. I returned home to change out of my blood-soaked raiment, but by the time I returned to the temple, my shame had become public. I was escorted from the temple precincts and told never to return. When my father returned home that evening, he banished me from his home, despite my dear mother's entreaties. As I reflect back on those days, I think my mother may have begun to suspect the reason for my lack of enthusiasm for marriage, despite being 4 years into my manhood. My mother pressed what few shekels of household money she had into my palm as I left, along with a package of food. In a moment I had descended from the topmost steps on the Judean staircase, a Kohanim, to the very bottom and untouchable. I spent that first miserable night tearfully in the garden of the olive press. I was completely at a loss as to what to do. My sheltered upbringing had left me completely unequipped for life in my new estate. As morning dawned, the full extent of my predicament became clear. I was without a home, without a position, without any means of support. My worldly assets were confined to a few shekels, clothes I'd been able to carry from my former home, and the remainder of the food my mother had given me. Was I to end up a wretched beggar pleading for alms at the gate of the temple, or one of the houses of the nobility along with the old and crippled? I told myself, no, I'm Kohanim by birth, even if no longer by community. Kohanim do not beg for alms. I changed from my upper class clothing, albeit now a little soiled, into the oldest clothes that I'd retrieved from my former home, as more befitting my new station in life, and I made my way to the labourers' quarter. These were people with whom I'd not previously associated. In fact, I had never even visited this quarter of the city. Even our family slaves were not of that class, day labourers of the lowest echelon, tinkers, whores, petty thieves, runaway slaves. My cultured accents stood out painfully among their rough dialects, which seemed to comprise mostly curses. I took the precaution of discarding my purse, dividing my meagre cash of shekels about my person. To my surprise, most of these ruffians were quite friendly. In our Judean society it was and is not uncommon for persons of moderate or even high standing to fall on hard times, either because of scandal or failure to pay their bills. However, I had no idea about how to set about seeking employment or lodging. Fortune was with me, however, when late in the day, tired and hungry, I parted with a quarter denarius at a low-class eatery. I was still sufficiently unaccustomed to my new situation to consider it low class. Bread was coarse, meat was unidentifiable, and the wine was sour. None of it seemed likely to have received priestly benediction. Customers sat at benches alongside a trestle table, a far cry from the upholstered couches characteristic of my former life just a single day ago. My seatmate was a whore, far from the first blush of youth, but kindly. Having heard my accent when I ordered my food, she was curious about my provenance. Of course, I could not for shame tell her the true circumstances of my downfall, so I indicated that I had fallen on hard times economically. She offered that I might stay at her home for the night, just the one night, mind, that she would help me look for work the following day. My new friend, who styled herself Asherah, told me she was not working that day on account of her monthly courses. No, she assured me she would not be entertaining any clients that night. As dusk fell, we made our way to her home, hovel I would previously have said, a single tiny room beneath a butcher's shop, the latter providing enough olfactory assault on the senses. There was a single coverlet spread on a dirty rush floor. Attached to the wall, a shelf that housed her meagre possessions, a metal plate, knife and spoon, the cosmetic accoutrements of her trade, a change of clothing which hung on a peg. Night fell, the temperature dropped. When it was time to douse the candle, there was no help for it to be lying together under the coverlet. To my embarrassment, Asher decided she would show her new acquaintance a kindness of a sexual sort. As her guest, and with nowhere else to go, I was not really in a position to spurn her advances. Thus it was that this Kohanim, who was already abominated as one who lay with man as with woman, now found himself defiled again by lying a woman in time of her menstrual uncleanness. And this time there was no possibility of washing, for I reasoned that by now I was so ritually unclean that it probably didn't matter. Asherah was as good as her word. I really do not know why I deserved her kindness. Having learned that I could read and write, a rare novelty in those circles, she assured me that I would be much sought after, and to be sure not to sell myself too cheap. So Asherah offered to act as my agent in this transaction. How could I refuse, even at the risk of being cheated? Together we wended through the narrow, twisting streets of the labourers' quarter, till we found ourselves outside a building whose rank odour was out of the ordinary, even in those parts. The owner, Thessalonican, was a trader in animal skins. To my horror, I found that a large part of his inventory originated as the hides of the animals that were slaughtered in the temple, along with their counterparts from pagan temples. My task was to assist with sorting and tying up bales of skins of each type, ox, sheep or goat, for transport to Thessalonica to be tanned. Asher extolled my abilities to the owner, emphasizing my ability to keep the tallies of the different categories of hide. My pay began at 1.5 denarii daily, which Asher took 1 denarius for my first day's wages as her finest fee. I began work at once, by now only ruefully aware of the ritual uncleanness associated with the hides of dead animals. Ironically, my duties including pushing the heavy wooden-wheeled cart to and from the temple, emptying the forward route, then loaded with hides at an unobtrusive side door for a much more strenuous return. At first I feared running across some of my former associates, or even my father, on my travels to and from the temple. However, I soon realized that the handlers of animal hides were most unlikely to encounter them. I have to say that I gradually developed acceptance of my new life. Thessalonican came to rely on me more and more, to the extent that I ended up keeping his books. To assist him, I undertook to learn the Greek language, which the Thessalonian spoke as his native tongue. I also taught myself the written language with its strange alphabet, compared with scriptural Hebrew. Eventually, and I'm now moving many years forward, the Thessalonican gave up the business and retired to his native country. I took it over, using the list of business contacts I'd made across the seas. A more profound change came over my spiritual life. As one newly arrived at the bottom of the Judean staircase, my former spiritual life seemed completely irrelevant. Here was I, a Jew, yet ritually unclean from daybreak to day's end. The rituals of my faith had no meaning for me. A sodomite, I could expect no reward in either this life or the next. Indeed, in the labourers' quarter, there was no shortage of partners for any form of perversion. Even those who desired carnal knowledge of animals could be accommodated. This abomination should, according to the holiness laws, have resulted in death of both man and beast. However, in the fetid environment of the labourers' quarter, it attracted neither comment nor condemnation. And thus, several years after the execution of the Galilean, whose arrest I had witnessed in the garden of the olive press, a new spiritual discipline arose among the inhabitants of the labourers' quarter. Known as the Way, it derived from the belief that the Galilean was actually the long-awaited Messiah, who had miraculously appeared to several of his followers after his execution. Stories began to circulate about the teachings he had shared with his followers while he was in human form. One of his sayings had a special resonance for me as I contemplated my former studies of the law. Concerning the Shema, I said ritual Jewish prayers. For, said the Messiah, or teacher as he was also known, all that is required is to love God with all your heart, mind, soul and strength, and your neighbour as yourself. Do these things and you will embrace the essence of all the other commandments of Torah. The new movement was characterized by an infectious enthusiasm, but more important for we in the labourers' quarter, it was open to all. One of Asher's friends first invited me to meetings of the Way. They're held on the first day of the week rather than on Sabbath. That's when the Messiah had been said to rise from the dead. One of the adherents of the Way, a man called Paul of Tarsus, he had made what seemed to be an outrageous claim. He said that everyone was equal in the eyes of this Messiah. There was no distinction between Jew and Gentile, nor between slave and free, or even between male and female. A brotherhood and sisterhood, but followers of the Way took root in our labourers' quarter. and we welcomed as adherents even those of us of abominable persuasions in the traditional mind. I can hardly describe my joy at finding a community where I'm welcomed as a full member rather than as an outcast. More than happy, I was honoured to offer my trading operations small warehouse for our meetings. We prayed together among the bales of salted animal hides. The participants told stories that had been handed down about life and teachings of the teacher. Afterwards, we participated in a special meal of bread and wine, which was said to recall words that he had spoken to his followers at a meal on the last night of his life. Later, I learned this liturgy by heart. So will the followers of the way, for each of us has, in turn, the honour of leading the prayers and breaking the bread for all to share. The teacher spoke of the kingdom of God, which he said now draw near. Envisage that kingdom as a paradise on earth. Be justice for all, equality for all, no oppression of the poor or the needy. It will be God's reign here on earth. It was powerful and heady stuff. It was especially appointed for us in the labourers' quarter. The teacher was reputed to have frequently eaten with people like us, prostitutes and other sinners. Maybe he might even have deigned to eat with me. We follow the Judean liturgies as practiced in the synagogues, to which we add stories of Jesus the Anointed One. The stories of the Galilean Messiah are the ones that most stir the hearts of our little company. Their new members have shed heavy tears as they repented of their former lives of treachery and thievery. However, keeping kosher is impossible in the labourers' quarter. Besides, many of our members are Gentiles who are attracted to the way, but who remain uncircumcised. Over the years, our community recognized the stories about the life and teachings of Jesus the Messiah were in danger of being lost. Many members who were present at the beginning have now passed on to their eternal lives. We realized that the only way to preserve the knowledge of the teacher was to commit their stories to papyrus. Even in the labourers' quarter, we were aware that a new movement was developing right across the world, in Rome, in Greece, and even in Africa. We therefore decided to transmit the word in the Greek language. Since I had learned to write this tongue, it was my responsibility to create the manuscript. Members of the movement contributed stories about Jesus at our weekly meetings, and I endeavoured to write them down. We assembled them later into coherent order in a codex. I allowed myself just one personal indulgence. I included the story of the young man whose garment was snatched away on the night of Jesus' arrest.